Welcome to this concluding press conference. I don't think our three speakers need much introduction, but just for the record, we have with us Alexander Kmnett, the president of the first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the end of this very important meeting. Laurent Gisel is head of the Humanitarian Disarmament Unit at the International Committee of the Red Cross, and Beatrice Fihn, Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. So let me pass the floor first to you, Ambassador Kmnett, please.
Thank you very much. It's not on, no?
Is it working? Yep.
Yes.
Good.
Okay.
Very good.
I will speak loud anyway. Thank you very much for being here. I think you've witnessed the conclusion of the meeting, a very historic meeting, demonstrating very clearly, first of all, what is possible when states work together. We have sent a very strong, powerful signal of effective multilateralism and the multilateral spirit. That is important. If you look at the documents that we have adopted, first of all, let me point you to the declaration, our commitment to a world free of nuclear weapons, which is, I'm sure of it, the most powerful multilaterally negotiated document on nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament probably ever. It's extremely strong. It demonstrates that this community does not accept the nuclear weapon status quo, that this community bases its positions on very strong and powerful arguments, which are all laid out in this document. We would never be able to agree on such a document in any other treaty framework. But in this treaty framework, we can. And it's very important that these things have been said and have been agreed by a multilateral treaty, by consensus, by states parties. We know that not everybody agrees with the message that we have just adopted, but it is a very powerful message, and I think this is what we are sending to the outside world, an extremely strong message on nuclear weapons, on the need to move away from this paradigm, which is an existential threat to all of us. We have also adopted an action plan, which is full of concrete actions that this community is going to take to move this treaty forward. So I would say we have sent a powerful message of the importance of this treaty, of the seriousness with which we are going to work to implement it, and take this forward. So I have to say, for me personally, of course, this was a wonderful moment with a lot of work that my team and I have put into this. So it's great, and also because now I'm an ex-president, I can say that my country, of course, is very proud of having been able to play this role, and also for the very powerful messages on humanitarian consequences and risk that the meeting on the 20th of June sent. So all this put together, I think, is an extremely important contribution against the backdrop that is very dire. And as I said in the meeting, everything points in the wrong direction, and this treaty points in the right direction. So maybe I stop here and let you pass it on.
Please. Well, thank you very much indeed. Mr. Gisel.
The International Committee of the Red Cross and more broadly Red Cross and Red Crescent movement has called for the prohibition of nuclear weapons since 1945, and since then we worked tirelessly towards this goal. This decade-long and difficult road highlights the significance of this meeting that the President just recalled, the former President, as you said yourself. I would like to commend Austria and Ambassador Kmnett in particular for his excellent work as President, and all state parties and observer states for their active, constructive and meaningful engagement in this historic first meeting of state parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. From our perspective, the meeting has been a full success. State parties established a solid framework with concrete measures for the treaty effective implementations and progressive universalization. The meeting and the declaration it adopted clearly situates the treaty within the broader nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation architecture and demonstrated its significant added value. It sends a clear signal that the TPNW can have a real impact on future efforts towards nuclear disarmament and on the lives of all those affected by the use and testing of nuclear weapons. The establishment by this meeting of a scientific advisory group is a further promise for the effective implementation of the treaty. We were encouraged to see the strong participation by a large number of state parties. This is a testament to their determinations to continue and even increase efforts towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. Among other, states committed in the declarations to further highlight the evidence regarding the humanitarian consequences and risks posed by nuclear weapons. Actually, this was already the case during the meeting itself. I was particularly moved by the testimonies of victims of use or testing of nuclear weapons, and also by the commitments of the youth to continue carrying their message. States also committed to develop national plans for the implementation of their victim assistance and environmental remediation obligations, including budgets and timeframe, and such practical steps are critical to achieving the humanitarian aims of the treaty. We were also encouraged to see several states that have not yet signed the treaty attend this meeting as observers, and to hear many constructive points in their statements. Cooperation and assistance with states outside of the TPNW can contribute significantly to achieving the objective of the treaty. It is important to explore the complementarity and develop synergies with the Non-Proliferation Treaty and other nuclear disarmament instruments, which all share the common aim of achieving a world free from nuclear weapons. Yesterday, the Council of Delegates of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement adopted a new resolution and multi-year action plan on nuclear weapons. It recommits all movement to continue working to reduce the risk of nuclear weapons use and to keep the catastrophic human costs of these weapons at the center of all nuclear disarmament debates and efforts. We will continue to work tirelessly to strengthen the membership of the TPNW and its implementation. And we reiterate our call on all states that have not yet done so to join the treaty without delay. We still have a long road ahead of us, but we look forward to continuing working with all states to achieve the treaty's humanitarian objectives until a nuclear weapons-free world becomes a reality. And this meeting demonstrated that this is a real possibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Ms. Fihn.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here on this very positive day, which we don't have too many of in this field, so it's really, really great. And I think against that backdrop of the recent explicit threats to use nuclear weapons by Russia and the increasing dangers of nuclear war, we are so pleased and welcoming that the states parties to the TPNW condemn unequivocally any and all nuclear threats, whether they be explicit or implicit, and irrespective of the circumstances. And this is really the strongest condemnation of nuclear threats by a multilateral UN conference. And that's extremely important right now. I'm also really pleased to see during this meeting and reflecting the final declaration that this is really a new global coalition using the TPNW to push back against unacceptable and illegal nuclear threats and the risks of nuclear war. And the groundbreaking Vienna action plan outlines concrete steps on this coalition will take to stop nuclear armed states from using nuclear weapons and move forward with eliminating. And this is really a coalition of states parties, but also other countries that are supportive of the treaty, survivors of nuclear weapons use and nuclear weapons testing, international organizations, of course civil society actors like ICAN, but also parliamentarians, financial institutions, youth, and people from all over have taken part in this and part of this meeting. And I also want to draw attention to the fact that the declaration concluded with an unprecedented commitment to this issue, that states parties agree that we will not rest until the last state had joined this treaty. The last war had been dismantled and destroyed, and nuclear weapons have been totally eliminated from the earth. This is really an incredible commitment from states. And I just want to also point out that this shows, this meeting for this week, shows that this treaty is so much more than an aspirational document. States parties, in partnership with survivors, impacted communities, civil society and international organizations, have really worked hard in the past 3 days to agree on a wide range of very specific, concrete and practical actions to take forward every aspect of the implementation of this treaty. And states parties took the really important decisions on condemning recent nuclear threats, starting to work on a trust fund to support people harmed by impact of nuclear explosions, establishing a scientific advisory board, setting a 10-year deadline for destruction of nuclear weapons, and getting more countries to join the TPNW in order to stop nuclear threats, stop nuclear arms races, and stop nuclear war. And these decisions have been based on the testimonies and lived experience of those who know firsthand what the actual impact of nuclear weapons use are. The action plan also underscored that very important principle of nothing about us without us, and making sure that survivors and impacted communities are included in these decisions. And it really ensures that the most affected by this weapon will be involved in moving ahead. And I think that the Vienna Declaration and the action plan are really how the world is now building a powerful norm against nuclear weapons, not through lofty statements or empty promises, but really hands-on, focused action involving a truly global community of governments and civil society. And really, here in Vienna, everyone was heard. So I just, this is really, to me, also just affirming the need for this treaty more than ever under these circumstances, that states parties really are resolved to move forward with its implementations, to stigmatize and delegitimize nuclear weapons, and steadily building a norm against them. So we are extremely pleased with this outcome and see it as a very important tool for improving the global situation in the world today.
Thank you very much indeed. So the floor is yours. Questions, please. Please, can you introduce yourself? Who you are and where you're from, and what organization you represent, media organization. Please, first question.
Thank you for organizing this briefing. May I ask also...
Please, could you introduce yourself?
Okay, so the question to all three of you. How do you evaluate the presence of observer states, especially the member states of NATO? Do you think their presence in the meeting has given a positive impact? And if so, how and why? Thank you.
Please. Shall I start with that maybe? I think it was very important, and I think we stated very clearly that we welcome the presence of observer states who have not yet made up their mind about the TPNW. I think it was very important for them to see what happened, how the meeting was conducted, how substantive it was. I would just generally refer all of you to really have a look at some of the statements that were made. Of some states that don't always speak on nuclear weapons issue, how incredibly substantive the statements were. Look at the statement from Trinidad and Tobago, for example. This is a treaty that gives voice to everybody, to much more stakeholders who all claim their right to speak on those issues. So it was important, I think, for skeptics to be here and to listen to that. And I think they will find it much harder to criticize the TPNW, to belittle the TPNW. I think there's really not much that can be belittled about what happened in the last few days here in Vienna. And I think it's, of course, we've always said we will not be able to coerce anyone, but we will convince. And I think that is very important. So we take it as a positive sign that they were here. We, of course, all understand that the political complexities around it, but it's a positive step that they were here. And we hope that next time there will be many more. Thank you. Bea, maybe?
Yeah. There were quite a lot of observer states here, and also want to recognize that there's a lot of observers here that are very supportive of the treaty, including the 4 countries that just recently ratified, and just the treaty hasn't entered into force for them yet. We had 8 states that were observers that announced that they are in the final stages of submitting their ratifications, so we also expect the membership to increase first. And then, of course, we have some that were not yet supportive of the treaty. I think it's very welcome that they engaged. We thought that some of them had very good contributions and really helpful way of framing this treaty. We know that there's been a lot of work done just to get some governments to come here, and I think that was very appreciated. And now we're working on to take the next steps. As from civil society side, our goal is that every single state in the world will join this treaty at some point, and we will continue to work for that. But in the meantime, we hope that everyone sees this for an extremely positive meeting, a huge contribution to regaining trust and confidence in the multilateral system, engaging a lot of new people. I don't know if you've observed how many young people that have been here as well and been part of the conversations around this. And really that we need to, no matter if a government supports this treaty just right now, need to really support multilateralism. And I think this treaty is a really excellent example of multilateralism and diplomacy, and we need to strengthen that more than ever. So I really appreciate their engagement, and we will continue to work with them.
Anything to add, Mr. Schumann?
Very little to add, because I agree with everything that has been said. The ICRC calls on all states to become a party to the treaty, and of course those which are not yet a party, we encourage them to sign and or to come as observers to this meeting. So we also see that as an extremely encouraging sign. And as I said, we heard many constructive elements in the statements of some of those observers. So that's a great development, and indeed an excellent proof that multilateralism works in these days despite the difficult circumstances.
Thank you very much. I believe you had a question. Could you wait for a microphone, please? Thank you very much. It's on its way. Right. So, please.
Yes. Thank you so much for doing this. My name is Gakushi Fujiwara from the Asahi Shimbun, Japanese newspaper. So first of all, congratulations. My question is, I have 2 questions. One question, so NPT review conference is around corner, and what can these outcome documents contribute to the success of the NPT LevCon? And my second question is, what is your direct message to the nuclear weapon states who is not attending here? Thank you.
I take the second question first. It's not my question. I think the states parties have just sent 3 pages worth of very strong statements including to the nuclear armed states. So I think the declaration answers your question much better than I will do in a few words. So please refer to the declaration. And on the NPT review conference, we all know that the situation is very challenging for the NPT. We of course hope that it will be a successful meeting, but the backdrop is very difficult. So we certainly hope that we have done as much as we can do to give positive momentum, to very clearly state the expectation of a very large part of the international community that we need more progress. And of course, we will make these points in the NPT as well. it will be difficult, but certainly for a large number of TPNW states parties who are also all states parties of the NPT, we have made very clear what our expectations are.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a very, I mean, I agree that the message is in the outcome document, in the declaration and in the action plan. But I think what we think that the nuclear armed states, not just the 5 in the NPT, but all 9, really need to hear is that threatening to use nuclear weapons is unacceptable and illegal under this treaty. And international law bans that behavior, and it's up to everyone to now not accept that kind of behavior in the international community. And that it's an incredibly dangerous moment right now. And I think that this is a massive contribution to putting pressure on nuclear armed states, including Russia, that kind of behavior will not be tolerated. And I also think that it's very important that this also sends a strong message that despite the fact that one of the 3 depositary states of the NPT has illegally invaded a non-nuclear weapon state, and a lot of countries around the world are very scared right now and wondering what that means for their security, so many countries are doubling down on their commitments to remain nuclear weapons free. And I think that's something that we very often take for granted, and we focus very much on the nuclear armed states and what do they think and what does a NATO state thinks. But the fact is that we should not take the current situation for granted. And if we follow the logic of some of the countries that believe in nuclear deterrence, then all countries will soon develop nuclear weapons. And this is an extremely important contribution to lowering tensions as well, and to really show that there is a strong sense in the international community that we do not want a world where every single government increases their reliance on nuclear weapons. So I just want to also make sure that we don't take these governments for granted, because the world is changing very rapidly and can change very negatively very rapidly. So I think that this is something that we need to celebrate and really cherish as a huge accomplishment under these extremely difficult global security circumstances.
If I can just add, because picking up on the NPT question, we hope that the NPT is going to be able to also express itself as clearly on the threat of nuclear weapons issue as we have just done.
May I ask a follow-up question?
By all means.
Okay, just a follow-up question. So reportedly, actually, so the original document has included the name of Russia, but could you explain why it's excluded, as far as you can think?
This is part of a regular negotiation process, so what you have in front of you is what enjoyed consensus. I think that's a very powerful document. I think that's all I need to say on this. There are different versions were discussed. This has, of course, been taken very seriously among states parties how to frame it. We now have decided on a very short, concise, but therefore even clearer message regarding nuclear threats.
Can I just add that a little bit to that? Because I also think that it's important to, I mean, from our perspective, very much important that we recognize that had this conference happened 6 months ago, I doubt that threats would have been the main focus. We would have talked a lot about possession of nuclear weapons, development, maybe testing, and the fact that there's such a big condemnation of one part of the prohibition, on the many prohibitions of this treaty, is a direct response to Russia's nuclear threats. There is no question that this document responds to the threats that Russia and Federation have done to use nuclear weapons recently. And of course it condemns all nuclear threats, because it also is about preventing additional nuclear threats to happen in the future. And we need to dissuade other nuclear weapon states and nuclear armed states from doing the same in the future. So I think it's just really, if it was up to ICAN, we would have written a very different document. But of course, I think this is important to remember that no United Nations conference or kind of treaty body in the UN has ever condemned nuclear threats in this way before, and that's a huge step forward.
Further questions? Go to you first, please, and then come to you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nobusunaga from Jiji Press, Japanese news agency. I also have a question about the NPT, especially regarding the complementarity. I'm wondering how you can develop this complementarity of the TPNW with the NPT, because the NPT allows 5 countries to possess the nuclear weapons, while the TPNW ban this completely. So what kinds of concrete measures could be taken? And one related question, and yesterday some NATO countries expressed their concern about the friction between the NPT and the TPNW. So do you think that with this complementarity, can you address their concern effectively? Thank you.
Maybe I take that first, unless you wanted to. So the states parties have said something very clear about complementarity in the declaration, but I also refer you to the working paper on complementarity, which is much more detailed. It explains extremely clearly how the TPNW is compatible with not only the NPT but with the regime as a whole. That's the first thing. Just very briefly explaining, the NPT contains the obligation on non-proliferation, but it also contains an obligation on nuclear disarmament. So the possession of nuclear weapons of the 5 states in the NPT is conditioned with achieving nuclear disarmament. And of course, we have made far too little progress on this. The TPNW is compatible with the NPT because it clearly supports the Article 6 of the NPT, which is the obligation for nuclear disarmament. So that is obviously, that's very obvious. And secondly, it is clearly supportive of the prohibition on the proliferation of nuclear weapons, because the TPNW, more than anything else, strengthens the taboo against nuclear weapons, because it stigmatizes the weapon. And if a weapon it stigmatizes, it prevents the proliferation. So that is a very clear complementarity with the NPT. And we are convinced that the crystal clear message on complementarity that we have sent will make it impossible to continue making these claims. If they are still going to be made, then I would refer them as well to read the documents. But they have been proven baseless. And what we have said at the get-go, we are going to have a very serious meeting with lots of substance. And it is our intention that a lot of the unfounded criticisms against the TPNW will fall away, because after this meeting they can be no longer maintained.
Thank you.
Yeah? Oh.
Yeah, please go ahead.
We also very strongly believe that the 2 treaties are complementary and that the TPNW complements the NPT for the reasons, all the reasons that Ambassador Kmnett mentioned, but also by simply prohibiting nuclear weapons. That's an extremely important step. We have seen with other weapons of mass destruction that this is an essential step towards their eliminations. Then it includes additional obligations. We just mentioned earlier the question of threats, and the TPNW precisely prohibits threats of use of nuclear weapons expressly, and the possession and stationing of nuclear weapons. And very importantly, it provides pathway for the future measure to achieve nuclear disarmament and verification. So all of that is very complementary to the NPT. And last, but very importantly, it introduced positive obligation in terms of victim assistance and environmental remediations, which is a first not only in the nuclear domain, but for weapons of mass destruction in general. So that's a very concrete element and a very important steps in terms of achieving the humanitarian goal of the treaty.
I just want to, because I can be a little bit less diplomatic, to say that one of the depository states of the NPT has illegally invaded a non-nuclear weapon state. That's the problem for the NPT. And if people start arguing that the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons and 65 states committing to never under any circumstances have or possess nuclear weapons, if they say that that's the threat to the NPT right now, that's just false. And we all know it, that it's false. So I think actually what we instead can see is a really positive momentum going into the NPT from this outcome. And I hope that a lot of the points in the declaration and in the action plan can also be used in the NPT to encourage progress. Of course, we know that countries like Russia and China and every country in the UN, almost except 4, have veto power in that. So it's going to be very, very difficult to get agreement into anything that will remotely address the current threats to use nuclear weapons right now in the NPT. So I think that we can see this as really also a very useful tool to increase pressure on those countries and to really highlight who is the problem here. It is not the non-nuclear weapon states that are the problem. It is the nuclear armed states themselves that are the problem in the NPT right now, and in particularly, of course, with Russia's nuclear threats. It's difficult to see how Russia will condemn itself in the NPT, for example. So yeah, I think that this can be really positive, and particularly concrete things like victim assistance and environmental remediation. We would love to see that also be brought up in the NPT context as a very positive outcome from this. And, of course, the complementarity between the two treaties, and issues like gender, for example, which has also been a very progressive part of this treaty. So we hope for a lot of positive contributions there.
Thank you. I believe you had a question. The microphone's just coming.
Thank you very much. I'm Sumi from the Mainichi newspaper, Japanese newspaper. So now I see a very clear and concrete framework of the TPNW, and political declaration is very remarkable. But still, I don't see the way that nuclear states to be involved. And I understand that this is just the beginning of the way. And I'm so sorry asking again, but how will you have the nuclear states in this treaty in the future? Thank you.
Over time, through the strength of the argument. The more every ratification for the TPNW is another clear sign that the nuclear status quo is not acceptable, that the legitimacy of the current nuclear status quo is not acceptable, and it will make it more and more difficult to maintain this security approach that's based on the threat of mass destruction and gravest global calamities, also on states and communities that are far removed, that have nothing to do with geopolitical tensions. And that's why I mentioned before statements like from Trinidad and Tobago, from the Comoros and others. It's very substantive statements. So that is really, it's a legal issue, and of course it's a political issue, but it's also a legitimacy issue. And that is a long process, and a difficult process. But as you said, we are embarking on it.
I just also want to add, government positions are not fixed, right? They change all the time, and we will continue to work to change governments' minds using this treaty. And we've seen it work in other treaties, and we're seeing it working here with this treaty. And just the fact that there were several observer states who did not participate in the negotiations showed up here is a sign that things are changing over time. And I also just want to remind people that some of our biggest achievements on arms control and disarmament have happened after huge crises. And I think that's what we're trying to prepare for. We can never predict what will happen in the future, but what we can make sure is that when a moment and an opening comes, we are ready for it. And we have seen moments and openings in the past that we weren't ready for. The end of the Cold War, for example, we weren't as prepared, maybe globally like that. Had we had a treaty banning nuclear weapons, we have fully active civil society, international organizations backing it, majority of states from the world part of it, maybe we would have seen a very different scenario then. Or in 2010, when there was a New START treaty and there was a big sort of optimism about these issues. Had we had a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, then against the backdrop, we could have seen a very different thing. So we don't know. Nobody knows what will happen, right? But is that a reason to let it go be worse? No. We are doing all of the groundwork. So when there is an opening in any country that continues to rely on nuclear weapons, we push. And that's the job of civil society to do, really.
There were very concerning statements that were mentioned before, and in March already the International Committee of the Red Cross expressed alarm about recent statements with regards to nuclear weapons and called upon all states to never use it. And indeed, it can also be a trigger point to realize that how nuclear disarmament is so important, because we realize with those statements that actually as long as they exist, there is a risk that they are used, and that this risk is unacceptable from a humanitarian perspective, from a legal perspective, from a moral perspective. So that can also and should trigger actually further commitment to eliminate those weapons, because that's the only way to make sure they are never used. So we hope that that will be also the way states will eventually react to in that regard and evolve in their position in that respect.
Thank you. We have a question right here, please.
Setsuko Inaki, Nippon Television Network. It's a Japanese TV, obviously. I just want to go back to the civil society delegation combination. How happy were you? I mean, as far as my understanding is that ICRC and ICAN is specifically named in the document that you will be taking part in the negotiation further on. And I think that's something unprecedented. And I just want to understand if this is, my understanding is correct, number one, and how do you feel about that? I mean, is that an achievement? And then also, just for the, now that it's the end of the first one, were you happy? Did you feel that your input was fully incorporated? Thank you.
Never fully.
Yeah, I mean, this is also why we call this the action plan, for example, groundbreaking. This is the first time in a weapons of mass destruction treaty that civil society have been included to this extent. And it's a really it's a good sign that this is a very modern treaty, fit for 21st century diplomacy. It is not a Cold War instrument with these very outdated ways that we still are stuck with in a lot of other parts of the international system. So we are very pleased with all of these references and that we are included to such a large extent. We are not states, we don't have voting rights, we are not part of the decision making, but the fact that we can be there and make our voices heard and to engage with states and provide input and advice and support, that victims and empathic communities are so, their work and their voices are so reflected in these documents, but also part of the decision making. And I want to repeat again this, nothing about us without us. It's very common, right, that these instruments talks about victims as a passive position, but here they are advocates as well and included in the conversations. And I think that's extremely groundbreaking, and again, something that maybe we can also use as a positive model in the NPT. NPT is very restrictive for civil society, and we've seen from the United Nations that the more restricted a forum is for civil society, the less progress they make these days. Governments need pressure in order to actually compromise and agree on something. When they're left alone in silence and can block anything, there's no incentive for them to actually negotiate So I think that the fact that civil society and the International Committee for the Red Cross are involved in this process really strengthens the treaty and shows that it's responding to today's context.
If I may just add to that, is that the treaty itself, and that's very important, the treaty itself recognized the role of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Federation, and ICAN in the meeting of state parties, and we are, of course, extremely glad that this is reflected throughout all the documents that have been adopted in terms of the mechanism established by this meeting. And we will continue to provide our expertise to state parties and everybody else with regard to the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and with regard to international humanitarian law. But that's extremely important indeed, and that's something that is more modern than other nuclear disarmament treaties and very important from our perspective.
Can I just add from the perspective of states parties? It's of course the recognition of the extremely important role both the ICRC and ICAN have played in bringing the TPNW about. But it's also the conviction of states parties that change in the nuclear weapons on the nuclear weapons issue will only happen through a much broader discourse, societal discourse. And for that, of course, the participation of civil society, of academic expertise, of experts, of a broad range of stakeholders is extremely important. So that was very clearly recognized by states parties who like this interaction with civil society and the ICRC to change things on this issue. And it has been recognized in the rules of procedure very clearly. So ICAN and the ICRC have been given special rights in the rules of procedure for the future, how we're going to work together.
Which was adopted already 3 years ago?
No, the rules of procedure were adopted at the beginning of the meeting of states parties. They have been negotiated specifically for this meeting of states parties, and now we have the rules of procedure with which we are continue to work in this framework of the treaty.
Please use the microphone. Thank you.
So just to understand, so the position or the status of the two organizations is now, because of this meeting and because of the decision of the meeting, is sort of like confirmed, that officially, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I mean, as Laurent said, both organizations are already mentioned in the treaty, and we had, of course, rules of procedure for the negotiations of the treaty. But now we are in a different phase. We are now no longer negotiating the treaty, we are implementing the treaty. So we needed new rules of procedure for the implementation. And you can say that the role of the ICRC and ICAN has been reconfirmed in the rules of procedure for the implementation, which I think is very important.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. So with, any concluding remarks before we close?
You start.
No, just wanted to reiterate, right, that this is the fact that so many governments got together and really condemned nuclear threats and condemned the possession and reliance on nuclear weapons. I think it's extremely important in a very uncertain world. We're seeing nuclear armed states work very hard to increase their influence over other countries, making advances with military arrangements. And if we don't do this work, we might see the whole world divided itself up into many more nuclear armed states or many more nuclear umbrellas and coalitions where nuclear weapons will be hosted and exercised with in ways like that. So I just want to reiterate what an important contribution this is to global international peace and security, because this is really recommitting countries to remaining nuclear free despite the very challenging and threatful situation in the world today.
So as I mentioned earlier, The International Committee of the Red Cross believe that this meeting of state party was a full success. We find that the documents that were adopted, including the declaration and the plan of actions, are very strong with a meaningful commitment that show the road going forward in the implementation of the treaty and towards its universalizations. And we have also seen a very positive sign this week and recently in terms of new states joining the treaty, more states than expected coming to the conference also as observers, and we are hopeful that there would be more states joining in the coming future. So we hope all of that will be a very positive momentum, including going towards the 10th review conference of the NPT.
Maybe the only one thing I want to add is that we have had a very serious meeting as we set out to do. We have demonstrated that we have a substantive meeting. We have demonstrated that we are basing our arguments on very profound set of evidence on the humanitarian consequences and risks, that this raises a whole range of extremely profound issues for the international community as a whole. And I think it is now time for those who have been skeptical to recognize this and engage constructively with the profound issues that we raise, which really hasn't happened all that much. So we have seen a few encouraging statements of the observers who were here, as Beatrice has pointed out. But as a whole, we have seen very little engagement. And I hope, and I'm convinced actually, that after this meeting, this is a position that should be seen as untenable. Rather, active and constructive engagement with this community that is committed to making progress on the nuclear weapons issue, and that is entirely constructive. So that would be my closing message.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for coming. And for those of you who have travelled, safe travels home.
Thank you. Thank you. Laurent, a pleasure to work with you. Yeah? Thank you. Thank you.